A drunk millionaire walked into the wrong room. What happened next changed everything. The sound of crystal shattering against the wall echoed throughout the Montgomery mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Alexander watched the shards reflect the light of the Venetian chandelier while the last drops of whiskey ran down the Italian marble wall. His blue-gray eyes, normally calculating and cold, were clouded not only by the alcohol, but by the anger and disappointment that consumed him. Victoria, he muttered under his breath, remembering the scene he had witnessed hours before his bride, fell in the arms of Marcus Bennett, his supposed best friend since Harvard Business School, hidden in one of the private boxes during the Montgomery Foundation's benefit ball. On the lower floor of the mansion, Catherine Thompson was finishing organizing the library, her favorite place on the property. Her delicate fingers slid along the spines of the books as she organized them, allowing herself a moment to admire the vast collection. It was hard to believe that she had only been there 3 months working as a housekeeper in one of Greenwich's most prestigious mansions. The generous salary allowed her to help her sister Madison pursue medicine at UCLA, fulfilling the dream that her humble beginnings in Idaho had almost prevented. Catherine smiled as she thought about her last call with her sister, who was talking excitedly about her anatomy classes. The sound of glass breaking brought her back to reality. She hesitated for a moment, torn between her professional duty to check what had happened and the awareness that she should keep her distance from her boss, especially at that time of night. He opted for the first option. After all, he was responsible for the well-being of the house and its occupants. Climbing the stairs silently, Catherine found Alexander staggering down the second-floor hallway. I had never seen him in this state. The man who had always displayed absolute control over himself and others was now barely able to stand. "Mr. Montgomery, are you okay?" His soft voice carried a genuine concern that went beyond his professional duties. Alexander turned sharply, almost losing his balance. For a moment their eyes met, and Catherine noticed a vulnerability she had never imagined seeing in this man. "I'm fine," he replied wryly, his hoarse voice betraying the lie. "I just found out that my fiancé and my best friend have been having an affair for months, but that's perfectly normal in our social circle, isn't it?" Catherine felt her heart sink. Despite the social distance between them, pain was universal. "I'm sorry, sir. No one deserves to go through this." Something about the sincerity of those simple words seemed to strike Alexander. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as another employee, but as a human being who showed empathy without ulterior motives. "Why do you work here, Catherine?" The question came out unexpectedly. "You're young, intelligent. I saw you reading Dostoevsky in the library when you thought no one was looking." Catherine blushed, slightly surprised that he noticed. "My sister is in medical school. Our parents passed away 5 years ago, and someone needs to help her achieve her dream." Alexander laughed humorlessly. "At least you have a noble purpose. I've built a financial empire, and I have no one to share it with who actually cares about me, not my bank account." The hallway was silent for a few moments, just the tick-tock of the old clock marking the time. Catherine realized she was witnessing a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who lived behind emotional walls. "Perhaps," she began hesitantly, "you should rest. Things will look different tomorrow." "Different?" Alexander approached his expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of whiskey. "Nothing ever changes in this world, Catherine. People always want something from you." "Not all," she replied softly, holding his gaze. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere between them. Alexander looked past the discreet housekeeper, noticing the honey-colored eyes that conveyed a disconcerting honesty. Catherine, in turn, saw beyond the arrogant billionaire, perceiving a wounded man who had built his empire perhaps to compensate for other absences. "You should go rest," Catherine suggested, gently breaking the moment. "I can bring some painkiller and water to your room." Alexander nodded, suddenly aware of his vulnerability. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything." As she watched him walk away toward the master suite, Catherine felt that something fundamental had changed that night. An invisible line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. In her room later, Catherine tried to focus on her book, but her thoughts kept returning to the encounter in the hallway. As a housekeeper, I knew I had to maintain professionalism above all else. But as a person, he couldn't ignore the unexpected connection he felt. Alexander, in his room at the other end of the mansion, stared at the ceiling as sobriety slowly returned. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't business or betrayal that occupied his mind, but rather a pair of kind eyes and sincere words that had penetrated his carefully constructed defenses. Montgomery Mansion fell asleep under the starry sky of Greenwich keeping, the secrets of that night that would forever change the fate of its inhabitants. Dawn would bring with it not only a new day, but the beginning of a story that neither of them could have predicted. Breakfast at the Montgomery Mansion always followed a meticulous ritual. Catherine supervised the kitchen staff from the early hours of the morning, ensuring everything was spotless. On this particular morning, however, his hands were shaking slightly as he arranged the silver tray. Miss Thompson rose. The middle-aged cook touched his shoulder. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted." Catherine forced a smile, adjusting the Wedgwood china cup on the saucer. "I'm fine, I just didn't sleep very well." In fact, he had barely been able to sleep a wink after his nocturnal encounter with Alexander. The words exchanged in the hallway echoed in his mind, along with the vulnerability he had seen in her eyes. It was disconcerting to see the powerful Alexander Montgomery stripped of his social masks. As Catherine went upstairs with the coffee tray, she encountered Mrs. Peters, the stern senior housekeeper, who was watching her with a critical eye. "Mr. Montgomery has cancelled all meetings this morning," the lady with her grey hair perfectly styled reported. "He specifically requested that you bring breakfast to his office, not his room." Catherine felt her stomach turn into knots. It was unusual for Alexander to drink coffee in the office, much less specifically request his presence. Trying to maintain his professional composure, he walked down the oak hallway to the imposing office door. His soft knocks were answered by a hoarse, "Come in." Alexander sat behind his mahogany desk, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, although his dark circles under his eyes betrayed the turbulent night. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," Catherine said softly, placing the tray on the side table. "Catherine." He looked up from the documents he pretended to read. "About last night?" "No need to mention, sir," she interrupted gently, starting to pour the coffee. "We all have difficult times." Alexander watched her intensely. "Do you always do this? Do you minimize important situations with such grace?" "I just try to be practical," she replied, handing him the cup. His fingers brushed briefly, sending an electric current down her spine. "I got a call from Victoria this morning," he commented, his voice controlled. "She wants to talk, explain her version of the facts." Catherine felt an inexplicable pang in her chest. "And will you find her?" "Why do you care?" Alexander leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Why did you show so much concern last night?" "Because it's the right thing to do," she replied simply. "Because sometimes people need to be seen as they are, not as their social position defines them." A dense silence filled the office. Alexander stood up, approaching the window that offered a panoramic view of the mansion's gardens. "You know what's ironic, Catherine? In all these years, I've built an empire based on my ability to read people, to anticipate their intentions, and yet I failed miserably to see the betrayal right under my nose." Catherine remained silent, watching his profile, silhouetted against the morning light. There was a palpable loneliness in his posture that belied all his apparent strength. "Perhaps," she began hesitantly, "you were so focused on protecting your interests that you forgot to protect your heart." Alexander turned sharply his eyes, meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What about you? What do you protect, Catherine Thompson?" "My sister," he replied without hesitation. "Our dreams, our chance at a better life." "Dreams," he murmured, moving closer. "Do you still believe them?" "I believe they are what keep us human," she replied instinctively, taking a step back. The phone rang, breaking the moment. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if putting on his professional mask. "Thanks for the coffee, Catherine," he said, formally returning to his desk. "And for last night." She nodded, picking up the tray with slightly shaking hands. As he closed the office door, he leaned against the hallway wall for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. That afternoon, while organizing the mansion's weekly schedule, Catherine received a message from her sister, Madison. A photo of her, smiling in her new white coat with the caption, "Look who passed their first exams, all thanks to you, sis." The image brought tears to his eyes. That was why she was there, she reminded herself. For Madison, for the dreams they shared, for the promise he made to his parents before they left. He couldn't afford distractions, especially not with his boss. But when Alexander passed her in the hallway later, their eyes met briefly, and Catherine felt that same inexplicable connection from the night before. Something had fundamentally changed between them, a subtle but irreversible change, like a page turned that could not be undone. The Montgomery mansion now held not only the secrets of the previous night, but also the seeds of something new and dangerous that was beginning to blossom in its silent halls. Catherine knew she had to keep her distance, preserve the professionalism her position demanded. But there was something in Alexander's eyes that called to her a truth that went beyond titles and social positions. The sun was beginning to set over Greenwich, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. In his office, Alexander held an untouched glass of whiskey, his thoughts involuntarily returning to a pair of honey-colored eyes that seemed to see through all of his defenses. In her modest room, Catherine tried to concentrate on her book, but the words danced gibberish before her eyes as her mind wandered to whispered conversations in dark hallways. Night fell over the Montgomery mansion, bringing with it the promise that nothing would be the same again. A week has passed since the night the betrayal was discovered, but the tension in the Montgomery mansion remained palpable. Catherine discreetly observed the subtle changes in the routine, Victoria's ignored calls, the long hours Alexander spent locked in his office, and the whispers of employees in the hallways. That Thursday morning, while sorting through the mail at the library, Catherine found an envelope that caught her eye. The cream-colored paper addressed to Alexander bore the letterhead of the law firm that had handled the Montgomery family's affairs for generations. "Miss Thompson." Alexander's voice surprised her, making her almost drop the stack of letters. "Any important correspondence?" "Yes, sir." She handed over the specific envelope, trying to ignore the tingling in her fingers as they briefly touched. "From Sullivan and Associates." Alexander examined the envelope with a grim expression. "My father used to say that good news never comes in lawyer envelopes." He opened the letter, his eyes quickly scanning the contents. Catherine noticed his jaw tense. "Catherine," he said after a moment of silence, "I need you to cancel all my appointments this afternoon, and could you accompany me to Greenwich Hospital?" The unexpected request took her by surprise. "Hospital, sir?" "My mother." He hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a rare gesture of nervousness. "She's hospitalized. Apparently she had a breakdown when she found out about my broken engagement. The doctor thinks it was an anxiety attack, but—" "Of course I follow," Catherine replied without hesitation, recognizing the vulnerability in her voice. "I will arrange everything immediately." An hour later, they were in Alexander's Audi R8, driving through the tree-lined streets of Greenwich. Catherine watched his tense profile, remembering what little information she had about Eleanor Montgomery. The family matriarch had rarely visited the mansion since her husband's death, preferring her apartment in Manhattan. At the hospital, the contrast between them was evident. Alexander in his impeccable Italian suit, Catherine in her simple work dress. But when Eleanor Montgomery saw them entering the private room, her tired eyes focused on the housekeeper with piercing curiosity. "So, you are Catherine," Eleanor said softly. "The nurses told me about you. The housekeeper my son mentioned on his last visits." Catherine blushed slightly, casting a surprised look at Alexander, who looked equally disconcerted. "Mrs. Montgomery, it is a pleasure to meet you, although I wish it were under better circumstances." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Sometimes we need bad circumstances to see what's in front of our eyes." She reached out to her son. "Alexander, darling, you're so thin. Haven't you been eating properly?" "Mum, please," he replied, but his tone was gentle. "You should be worried about your own health." "Oh, that," Eleanor made a dismissive gesture. "It was just a moment of weakness. But seeing you like this alone after everything, it reminded me so much of your father." Catherine realized the weight of those words. The late Richard Montgomery had been known not only for his business empire, but also for his dedication to his family, something Alexander seemed to have forgotten in his quest for success. Catherine Eleanor called, "Could you give us a moment alone?" In the hospital hallway, Catherine allowed herself to process the complexity of the situation. The way Eleanor had looked at her, as if she knew something that not even she herself understood yet. And Alexander, always so controlled, showing a genuine concern that humanized him even more. 40 minutes later, Alexander emerged from the room with slightly red eyes. Without saying a word, he started walking towards the exit. Catherine followed him, silently respecting his space. In the car, the silence persisted until they reached a small cafe far from the center. "Can we stop here?" he asked softly. "I need a moment before I go back." The cafe was cozy with antique wooden tables and a comforting aroma of freshly ground beans. Sitting in a discreet corner, they looked like two friends sharing a moment, not a boss and a maid. "My mother made me promise not to become like my father," Alexander said, finally staring at his untouched cup of coffee. Not in his professional success, but in the loneliness he carried even surrounded by people. Catherine watched him carefully. "And what did you answer?" "That it was already too late." He laughed humorlessly. "But she disagreed. She said she saw something different in me in the last few weeks, a change." Their gazes met, loaded with unspoken meanings. Catherine felt her heart quicken, aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. "Senior Montgomery." "Alexander," he corrected softly. "After today, I think we can dispense with the formalities, at least when we're alone." The sound of his cell phone broke the moment. It was Madison, his sister. Catherine hesitated, but Alexander gestured for her to answer. "Mana," Madison's excited voice echoed. "You won't believe it. I've been selected for a special research program, but there's one small problem. I need extra for materials." Catherine felt her stomach sink. His last salary was already committed to regular monthly payments. "Mad?" As Alexander asked suddenly. "No, sir, I couldn't." "Catherine." His voice was firm but gentle. "Let me help. Consider it a bonus for today." That night back at the mansion, Catherine lay in her bed reflecting on how life could change in a matter of days. The walls that separated their lives, socially and professionally, seemed increasingly tenuous. In his office, Alexander held a frame with an old photo of his family. His mother was right, something had changed, and for the first time in years, change didn't scare him. The Montgomery mansion fell asleep under a starry sky, while two hearts beat in tune, separated only by marble walls and social conventions that began to seem increasingly fragile. The news of Eleanor Montgomery's internment spread quickly among the mansion's staff. Catherine noticed the curious looks she had been receiving since accompanying Alexander to the hospital, especially from Mrs. Peters, who seemed increasingly suspicious of her closeness to her boss. The next morning, while supervising the cleaning of the main hall, Catherine was surprised by the unexpected arrival of Victoria Bennett. Alexander's ex-fiancée walked through the front door, as if she still owned the house, her Louboutin heels echoing off the marble floor. "Where is Alexander?" Victoria demanded, her blue eyes sparkling with determination. "He hasn't answered my calls." "In a week." "I'm sorry, Miss Bennett, but Mr. Montgomery is not receiving visitors," Catherine replied firmly, maintaining her professional demeanor. Victoria examined her with disdain. "You're just the housekeeper. Who do you think you are to stop me from seeing my fiancé?" "Ex-fiancé," a male voice cut through the air. Alexander stood at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of coldness. "Catherine, please leave us alone in the office." As she walked away, Catherine couldn't help but notice how Victoria held Alexander's arm possessively as she walked up the stairs. Something in her stomach tightened, a feeling she refused to recognize as jealousy. Concentrating on her tasks, Catherine tried to ignore the muffled sounds of arguing coming from the office. After 20 tense minutes, Victoria hurriedly left her cheeks stained with tears and smudged mascara. Later, during the dinner, Catherine was overseeing Alexander called her into the library. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the side table. Victoria wanted a second chance, he said without preamble. I said it was a momentary mistake, that we could get through this together. Catherine felt her heart quicken. And what did you answer? He said some mistakes can't be fixed. Alexander got up, approaching the window. But it wasn't just about the betrayal. I realized there was never truth between us. It was all about appearances, social connections, family expectations. Sometimes, Catherine began hesitantly, we need to lose something to realize we never really had it. Alexander turned to face her, his eyes intense. How do you do that, Catherine? How do you manage to say exactly what I need to hear? Maybe because I just say what I think, she replied softly. I have nothing to gain or lose from this. It does not have. He approached, his woodsy scent enveloping her. What if I told you that your words mean more to me than all the advice from my expensive consultants? The air between them was thick with tension. Catherine knew she should step back, maintain professional boundaries, but something kept her there, trapped in the blue-grey of those eyes. The moment was interrupted by Catherine's cell phone ringing. It was a message from Madison. Sis, I can't believe you got the money for the show. You're amazing. The message brought her back to reality. She was the housekeeper. She depended on this job to help her sister. He couldn't afford to dream of anything more. I need to check on dinner, she muttered, backing toward the door. Catherine, Alexander called when she was already on the threshold. Have dinner with me tonight. Not as master and maid, just as two people. The invitation hovered in the air like a soap bubble, delicate and dangerous. I don't think that would be appropriate, she replied, though her heart protested. Appropriate. He gave a bitter laugh. I've spent my entire life doing what was appropriate. Where has that gotten me? Alexander. His name escaped your lips like a prayer. There are lines we cannot cross. Why? Because society says a billionaire can't be genuinely interested in his housekeeper, or because you're afraid of what might happen if you let your own defenses down. The question hit Catherine like a punch in the gut. She turned and quickly left the library, her heart hammering in her chest. In his room later, he found himself rereading his parents' last letters, drawing strength from their words of encouragement. The next day, the mansion's routine continued, seemingly as normal, but there was an electric tension in the air whenever Catherine and Alexander met in the hallways. Each shared look, each unspoken word carried the weight of unexplored possibilities. Mrs. Peters watched everything with eagle eyes, her suspicions growing every day. Catherine knew she was walking on thin ice, but she couldn't help the way her heart raced every time she heard Alexander's footsteps approaching. The Montgomery mansion, with its silent hallways and ancient walls, now held yet another secret, the growing feeling between a man who had everything except what really mattered and a woman who had sacrificed her own dreams for someone else's. Night fell over Greenwich, bringing with it the promise that some lines once noticed cannot be ignored forever. In their respective rooms, separated by floors of social distance and convention, both Catherine and Alexander lay awake, contemplating the choices that awaited them on the horizon. The arrival of a registered letter from Greenwich Hospital broke the morning routine at the Montgomery mansion. Catherine watched Alexander's expression change as he read the contents. His mother had relapsed and would need to remain hospitalized for longer. I need to go there, he murmured, more to himself than to Catherine, who was discreetly sorting the mail on her desk. But I have that meeting with the Chinese investors. I can reschedule your appointments, Catherine offered, her soft voice betraying a concern that went beyond professional. Alexander looked up, studying her for a moment. Come with me again. My mother, she asked for you. The request made Catherine hesitate. After their last conversation in the library, they had both kept a cautious distance, like dancers performing a complex choreography of approaches and retreats. Mrs. Peters has noticed our closeness, she replied carefully. It may not be wise to feed the rumors. And since when do you care about rumors? Alexander stood up, approaching. The Catherine I met that night in the hallway didn't seem to care about appearances. That night was different. You were vulnerable, you needed someone. And now I don't have to. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Maybe I need it more than ever. The sound of heels in the hallway interrupted them. Mrs. Peters entered, without knocking, her sharp eyes registering their closeness before they could move away. "Mr. Montgomery, the documents for the meeting have arrived," he announced with icy formality. "And Miss Thompson, the cleaning crew, awaits your instructions in the East Wing." Catherine nodded quickly, escaping the office with her heart racing. While supervising the cleaning, her cell phone vibrated with a message from Madison. "Sis, I met someone special in the research program. I can't wait to tell you everything." Her sister's evident happiness brought tears to Catherine's eyes. Madison was living her dreams, building her future while she was developing forbidden feelings for her boss. Later, as the sun began to set, Catherine found Alexander waiting for her in the mansion's parking lot. "Get in," he said simply, opening the Audi's passenger door. The journey to the hospital was made in silence, full of unspoken words. In Eleanor's room, the Montgomery matriarch welcomed them with a sly smile. "Are you two again?" she commented, her discerning gaze alternating between them. "Alexander, darling, could you get me some tea? Catherine will keep me company." As soon as they were alone, Eleanor held Catherine's hand. "You know, my dear, I recognize the look I see in my son's eyes when he's near you. It's the same look Richard had when we first met. Mrs. Montgomery, please call me Eleanor." She gently squeezed Catherine's hand. "And don't try to deny what is obvious to a woman who has lived long enough to know true love when she sees it." Love. Catherine felt her face burn. "No, it's just gratitude, maybe. I helped him through a difficult time." "You did more than that," Eleanor smiled. "You saw him as a person, not as the Montgomery heir. Do you know how many people do that?" Before Catherine could respond, Alexander returned with the tea. The rest of the visit passed with light conversation, but Catherine felt the weight of Eleanor's words in her heart. Back at the mansion, a storm was beginning to brew. Large drops of rain clattered against the pane as Alexander and Catherine entered through the back door, avoiding the prying eyes of the other employees. "Thank you for today," he said softly, standing too close for Catherine's comfort. "My mum, she seems different when you're around." "Alexander," Catherine began, but the words died in her throat when thunder echoed, making her give a small, involuntary jump. He held her by the shoulders, steadying her. The touch, although innocent, sent waves of electricity throughout his body. Their faces were too close, their breaths mingling in the charged air. "Tell me you don't feel this way," he murmured, his eyes boring into hers. "Tell me I'm the only crazy one here." "I can't," she replied in a shaky voice, "but I also can't allow this to continue. Your mother is sick, you are vulnerable, and I have responsibilities." "With your sister," he added, pulling away slightly. "Always putting others first, aren't you, Catherine?" "It's who I am," she replied simply. A new clap of thunder lit up the hallway, revealing the silhouette of Mrs. Peters at the end of the hallway. The senior housekeeper quickly disappeared into the shadows, but the damage was done. Catherine spent the night awake, tossing and turning in her bed as the storm raged outside. In his master bedroom, Alexander gazed out at the rain, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, thinking about his mother's words during a brief private conversation. "Don't make the same mistake as your father's son. Don't let the fear of what others think stop you from being happy." The Montgomery mansion kept its secrets in the darkness of that stormy night, while two hearts fought against a force that grew every day, impossible to deny, but equally impossible to accept. And somewhere in the silent hallways, Mrs. Peters planned how to deal with what she had witnessed, determined to maintain order and propriety in the home she had served for decades. The news spread through the Montgomery mansion like wildfire. Mrs. Peters had requested an urgent meeting with Alexander. Catherine felt her stomach drop as she served breakfast, aware of the furtive glances of the other staff. "Miss Thompson." Mrs. Peters intercepted her in the hallway, her voice sharp as ice. "Mr. Montgomery wishes to see you in his office after our conversation." The wait was agonizing. Catherine tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept going back to the night before, to the moment of vulnerability shared during the storm. After an hour that seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Peters emerged from the office, his face an impenetrable mask. When Catherine entered, she found Alexander standing by the window, his hands in the pockets of his tailored Italian suit. "Close the door," he ordered without turning around. Ms. Peters has expressed concerns about our conduct. He began, finally meeting her gaze. She suggested it would be more appropriate to move it to another family property. Catherine's heart stopped for a moment. I understand, she managed to say, though her voice shook slightly. But I refused. Alexander continued, his voice softening. I told her that you are essential to the functioning of this house, and that I trust your professionalism implicitly. Alexander. However, he interrupted her gently, she's not completely wrong. What's going on between us, doll? We can't ignore it. Catherine felt her defenses begin to crumble. Nothing is happening. It can't happen. Can't or shouldn't. Alexander approached his presence, engaging as always. Because there is a crucial difference between the two. At that moment, the phone rang. It was from the hospital. Eleanor had worsened during the night and was asking to see her son urgently. The conversation would have to wait. During the journey to the hospital, the silence in the car was different from the previous ones, filled not only with tension, but also with unspoken possibilities. Catherine watched Alexander's profile, noticing the lines of worry on his face. At the hospital, they found Eleanor paler than usual, but her eyes still shone with that characteristic insight. You two look like you've seen ghosts, she commented, adjusting herself on the pillows. Mom, how are you feeling? Alexander asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. As someone who needs to tell some truths before it's too late, Eleanor replied, her gaze switching between the two. Alexander, do you remember what your father told me when we first met? Alexander frowned. That you were the most beautiful cleaning lady he had ever seen. Catherine held her breath, surprised by the revelation. Eleanor smiled. Yes, I worked at the Montgomery summer mansion in Newport. Your grandfather was furious when Richard announced he wanted to marry me. But you got married anyway, Alexander added softly, because your father had the courage to follow his heart. Eleanor reached for her son's hand. Something you've always been afraid to do, my dear. Catherine felt like she should leave, give them privacy, but Eleanor stopped her with a gesture. Stay, Catherine. You need to hear this too. Society will always try to tell us what's appropriate, what's expected, Eleanor continued. But in the end, it is our hearts that must dictate the path. Richard and I have had 30 wonderful years together, despite all the obstacles. Alexander stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the internal struggle he was waging. You two remind me so much of us, Eleanor whispered, her voice weakening. The same connection, the same fear of admitting what they feel. Mrs. Montgomery, Catherine began, but Eleanor interrupted her with a gentle smile. Life is too short to waste it on fear, my dear. Take it from someone who knows what they're talking about. The monitors began to beep, and nurses rushed into the room. Alexander and Catherine were forced to leave, watching helplessly as the medical team worked. Hours later, with Eleanor stabilized, but under observation, they returned to the mansion in silence. The rain had fallen again, creating a silvery veil over Greenwich. In the foyer, Alexander grabbed Catherine's arm before she could escape to her room. We need to finish our conversation. Not now, she pleaded softly. You're emotional, you're... Mother. That's right, he added. About everything, about us. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. Alexander, please. You're my boss. I need this job. My sister. What if I told you that we could find a solution that you don't have? To choose between your sister and... He hesitated. And us. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them quickly separate. It was Rose the cook bringing a tray of tea. Her eyes widened when she saw how close they were, but she discreetly continued on her way. Tomorrow, Alexander said quietly, dine with me in the garden gazebo, no titles, no social positions, just us. Before Catherine could respond, he had disappeared upstairs, leaving her alone with her whirling thoughts and the echo of Eleanor's words. In her room later, Catherine opened her laptop to see an email from Madison. Sis, I have big news. The research program could turn into a full scholarship, but I need your help to make a decision. Her sister's words brought both joy and apprehension. How could she consider her own desires when Madison's future depended on her, and yet Eleanor's words about not wasting your life on fear echoed in his mind? The Montgomery mansion fell, asleep in the persistent rain, as two hearts wrestled with decisions that could change not only their lives, but also the fate of everyone around them. At the hospital, Eleanor smiled in her sleep, knowing that she had planted the necessary seeds for love to triumph once again in the Montgomery family. The gazebo on the grounds of the Montgomery mansion had been transformed. Soft lights twinkled among the vines, and an intimate table for two was set with the family's finest china. Catherine watched the scene from her window, her heart divided between duty and desire. Madison's email was still open on her laptop. "Sis, this scholarship could change my life, but it means another year of expenses. I know I already do so much for myself." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibilities on her shoulders. A soft knock on her door startled her. It was Rose, the cook, wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress. "Mr. Montgomery asked me to deliver this," Rose said with a gentle smile. "He mentioned it matches your eyes." Catherine touched the soft fabric, feeling her last resistance begin to crumble. "Rose, what are people saying?" The cook sat on the edge of the bed. "Honey, I've worked for rich families for 30 years. You know what I learned? Money doesn't buy happiness, and hearts don't know social classes." At 8 o'clock, Catherine went down to the garden. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Alexander was waiting for her in the gazebo, without his usual business suit, wearing a casual shirt that made him look younger, more approachable. "You look beautiful," he said, simply pulling out the chair for her. Dinner was served by Rose personally, a deliberate choice by Alexander to avoid unnecessary gossip. The conversation flowed naturally, as if social barriers had momentarily disappeared. "I got news from the hospital today," Alexander commented, pouring wine into their glasses. "My mother is responding well to the treatment." "I'm glad to hear that." Catherine smiled, noticing how his eyes seemed lighter. "She is an extraordinary woman." "Yes, she is." Alexander paused, studying Catherine's face. "Do you know what else she told me yesterday? That for the first time in years she sees the same glow in me that she saw in my father when he was with her." Catherine felt her heart quicken. "Alexander—" "No, please let me finish." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I've spent my entire life trying to prove myself through financial success. I built an empire, but in the process I forgot what it's like to feel something real." A gentle breeze stirred the gazebo lights, creating dancing shadows on their faces. Catherine thought about her own journey, about the choices she had made out of love for her sister. "Madison has been accepted for a research fellowship," she revealed softly. "Another year of studies." "And you're worried about expenses," Alexander added, not as a question but as an observation. "I can't allow her to miss this opportunity." Catherine stared into her wineglass. "Just as I can't allow myself to dream of something that could jeopardize everything I've worked for." "What if you didn't have to choose?" Alexander caught her hand across the table. "Catherine, what I feel for you is not the whim of a bored rich man. It's something I've never felt before." "People will talk," she whispered, though she didn't remove her hand. "Mrs. Peters is already suspicious, and if it affects my position here—" "Then we will find another solution," he replied firmly. "But don't ask me to pretend I don't feel anything when every moment away from you feels like a waste." The sound of footsteps on gravel made Catherine instinctively step away. It was Mrs. Peters, standing at the entrance to the garden with a stern expression. "Mr. Montgomery," she called, her voice sharp in the soft night. "There is an urgent call from the board of directors." Alexander sighed, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Catherine, please don't leave. I'll be back in a few minutes." Alone in the gazebo, Catherine allowed the tears she had been holding back to finally fall. Her cell phone vibrated. It was another message from Madison, sending animated photos of the research lab. Her sister's happiness had always been her absolute priority, her moral guide. But now, for the first time in years, Catherine wondered if there was room in her heart for another kind of love. Alexander returned 15 minutes later, finding Catherine still sitting at the table, lost in thought. "Sorry for the interruption," he said, returning to his seat. "Where were we?" "Talk about impossibilities," she replied softly. "No," he corrected. "We were talking about possibilities." "Catherine, look at me." She looked up, finding a determination in him that scared and thrilled her simultaneously. "Tomorrow I will announce some changes in the management of the mansion," he declared. "Mrs. Peters will be transferred to our Boston estate with considerable promotion. Alexander, you can't do this because of me." "It's not because of you," he interrupted gently. "It's for us, for me. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing to be happy instead of just looking good in the eyes of society." The gazebo lights twinkled softly like stars caught between vines. Catherine felt something shift inside her, a silent acceptance that some battles don't need to be fought alone. "And Madison," she asked, her last worry still present. "Your sister will have all the support she needs to make her dreams come true," Alexander promised. "Just as you will have to accomplish yours, if you let me." In that moment, under the twinkling lights of the gazebo, Catherine Thompson made a decision that would change not only her life, but those of everyone around her. And when Alexander leaned in to kiss her for the first time, she didn't pull back. The Montgomery mansion silently witnessed that moment, its ancient walls keeping yet another secret of love that defied social conventions. At the hospital, Eleanor Montgomery smiled in her sleep as if she knew her son had finally found his way to happiness. The news of Mrs. Peters' departure spread through the Montgomery mansion like a controlled wildfire. Employees whispered in the hallways, torn between surprise at the sudden transfer and speculation about his true motive. Catherine tried to maintain her professional composure, but every curious glance in her direction made her stomach turn. "You shouldn't feel guilty," Rose commented as she helped Catherine organize the weekly menu. "Mrs. Peters received a promotion that many would only dream of." "But everyone knows it's not just that," Catherine replied, her voice low. "People aren't fools, Rose. They see what's happening." The kiss in the gazebo had changed everything, not just her relationship with Alexander, but the entire dynamic of the mansion. It was as if an invisible veil had been removed, revealing truths that could no longer be ignored. That morning, Madison called in tears. His research program advisor had suffered an accident and the future of the project was uncertain. "Sis, what if I lose the bag? All your sacrifice will have been in vain." Catherine felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. "Mad, listen, we're going to find a solution. We always do, don't we?" After hanging up, she found Alexander in his office, focused on documents on his desk. He looked up as soon as she entered, his face instantly softening. "Something wrong?" he asked, noticing her worried expression. Catherine hesitated. "It's Madison. Her research program is at risk and—" "As—" Alexander interrupted, already reaching for his pen. "No," she said firmly. "I can't take your money. Not like this." Alexander stood up, moving around the table to stand next to her. "Why not?" "Because it would make what's happening between us real—" "Because it would make me feel exactly like Victoria," she replied, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander took a step back as if he had been slapped. "Do you really think you're just like her, that I see you the same way?" "I don't know how you see me," Catherine admitted. "Everything is happening so fast. A week ago I was just your housekeeper, and now—" "And now you're the woman who made me rediscover who I really am," he added, his voice full of emotion. "The person who saw beyond the Montgomery name, beyond the bank account." A sound in the hallway made them instinctively move away. It was a hard habit to break even with Mrs. Peters leaving. The need to hide to keep up appearances was deeply rooted in both of them. "I need time," Catherine said softly, "to understand what this means for me and for Madison." Alexander nodded, respecting his space. "You will have time, but don't let fear of what others think define your choices. I learned that the hard way." That afternoon, Eleanor was released from the hospital. Catherine helped organize her return to the mansion, preparing the master bedroom with fresh flowers and her favorite books. When the Montgomery matriarch arrived, leaning on her son's arm, her discerning eyes immediately found Catherine. "Come here, darling," Eleanor called, dismissing the hired nurse. "I need your company while Alexander takes care of some matters." Alone in the room, Eleanor held Catherine's hand. "You're still fighting this, aren't you?" "It's complicated," Catherine replied, feeling tears threatening to fall. "Love always is." Eleanor smiled. Do you know what Richard told me when I decided to run away with him? How complicated it is to live a life of regrets. Catherine thought about Madison, about their shared dreams, about the nights she cried alone, thinking about the future. I have responsibilities. And Alexander has the resources to help, Eleanor added softly. There is no shame in accepting help from those who love you, Catherine. The shame is in denying happiness out of pride. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Alexander's return. He stood in the doorway watching the two most important women in his life talking intimately. Do I interrupt something? He asked, a half smile on his lips. Just a conversation between women, Eleanor replied with a mischievous glint in her eyes. Catherine was telling me about your sister. Alexander exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine, who felt her heart quicken. How had that man, who just a few months ago was just her distant boss, become so fundamental in her life? Actually, Eleanor continued, I was thinking about making a substantial donation to the UCLA research program. What do you think, Alexander? Catherine felt her cheeks burn. Mrs. Montgomery, I can't. Eleanor, dear. And it's not you who's accepting. It's the research program. The matriarch smiled. Sometimes fate offers us solutions that seem too complex to be true. Wisdom lies in recognizing them for what they are, gifts. That night in the mansion's garden, Catherine found Alexander sitting in the same gazebo where they had shared their first kiss. The lights still twinkled among the vines like stars trapped in time. Your mother is a force of nature, she commented, sitting down next to him. Just like you, he replied, intertwining his fingers with hers. Two extraordinary women who changed my life completely. Catherine looked at their joined hands, symbols of a connection that went beyond social class and expectations. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe some complications were just the universe opening doors that seemed impossible to pass through. Madison called again, she said softly. The program has found a new advisor. Alexander squeezed his hand gently, understanding the unspoken meaning of those words. The walls that Catherine had built around her heart were slowly beginning to crumble, stone by stone, revealing possibilities that once seemed like distant dreams. The Montgomery family's anonymous donation to the UCLA research program caused an uproar in the medical department. Madison called Catherine, overflowing with joy, completely unaware of the true source of the money that had saved her academic future. Sis, you won't believe it. Someone donated an astronomical amount of money to the program. All the projects were saved. The happiness in his voice made Catherine smile, even as her heart sank with the weight of the secrets she now carried. But the Montgomery mansion was also undergoing its own transformations. With Mrs. Peters' departure for Boston, Catherine temporarily assumed more responsibilities in managing the household. The change in her relationship with Alexander, although not officially declared, was noticeable to all employees. The Montgomerys have an interesting history with housekeepers, Rose commented one morning as they prepared breakfast. Seeing Catherine's questioning look, she continued, First Eleanor, now you. Maybe it's a family tradition to fall in love with women who see beyond appearances. Rose. Catherine blushed brightly, but couldn't hold back a small smile. Eleanor's recovery was progressing well, and she insisted on spending time with Catherine, sharing stories about her early days with Richard Montgomery. It was as if the matriarch was deliberately weaving a web of connections between past and present. Richard used to say that true wealth is in the choices we make for love, Eleanor commented during an afternoon of tea in the conservatory. He gave up a lot to be with me, but he never regretted it. Catherine absorbed every word, every story, finding surprising parallels to her own situation. How did you deal with social pressure? One day at a time, Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with memories, and with the certainty that true love is worth any sacrifice. That night, Alexander found Catherine in the library, his favorite haunt, since he started working at the mansion. She was organizing a new shipment of books, completely absorbed in her task. I knew I'd find you here, he said softly, making her start. Sorry, I should be supervising dinner. No, Alexander interrupted her gently, moving closer. You should be exactly where you feel happy. Catherine watched as he picked up one of the books she had just organized, a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. Interesting choice, she commented, trying to maintain a light tone despite her racing heart. A story about social prejudices and true love. Alexander raised an eyebrow, a half-smile playing on his lips. Maybe it's not such a coincidence. The silence that followed was charged with meaning. Catherine could feel the electricity in the air, the same tension that always came when they were alone. Madison is overjoyed with the donation, she finally said, her voice low. She has no idea. And you don't need to know, Alexander added softly. Sometimes other people's happiness depends on the secrets we keep. How do you do it? Catherine asked suddenly. Dealing with all the stares, the whispers? Alexander set the book aside and moved closer until Catherine could feel the heat of his body. Because for the first time in my life I don't care what anyone else thinks. I only care what you think. What about the board of directors, the shareholders? I've dealt with worse, he smiled, touching her face gently. Besides, my mother is on our side. And believe me, no one wants Eleanor Montgomery as their enemy. Catherine couldn't help but laugh, remembering the matriarch's fierce determination. She truly is a force of nature. Like you, Alexander murmured, leaning in to kiss her. The kiss was different from the previous ones. There was no longer the urgency of secrecy, just the sweetness of mutual recognition. When they separated, Catherine saw in his eyes the same certainty that was beginning to grow in her own heart. I have a proposal for you, Alexander said, still holding your face in his hands. How about we have dinner out tomorrow? A restaurant in New York, away from the eyes of Greenwich. A real date. Catherine smiled, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The first of many, I hope, he replied, his eyes shining with unspoken promises. Later in her room, Catherine wrote in her diary a habit she had maintained since her parents' death. The words flowed easily, full of emotion and hope. Dear Father and Mother, you always taught me that true love knows no barriers. Now I completely understand what you meant. Sometimes destiny presents us with choices that seem impossible, but it is exactly these choices that define who we really are. A soft sound at her door interrupted her. It was Eleanor leaning on her cane. Can I come? In, honey. Catherine quickly put the diary away. Of course, Eleanor, you should be resting. Rest is for old people. Eleanor smiled, sitting on the edge of the bed. And I have more important matters to attend to, like the future of my family. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Eleanor. No, let me speak. The matriarch raised her hand. I've seen the way you look at my son, Catherine. It's the same look I had when I first met Richard. And more importantly, I've seen how Alexander has changed since you came into our lives. Eleanor's words carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes, but she didn't stop them from falling. I'm afraid, he admitted softly, of not being enough, of disappointing. Oh, darling. Eleanor held her hands. The only way to disappoint is to not give love a chance. Take it from someone who almost made that mistake. The Montgomery mansion fell asleep that night under a starry sky, holding more secrets and promises within its ancient walls. The next day a new chapter would begin, not just for Catherine and Alexander, but for everyone their lives touched. Le Bernardin restaurant shined like a jewel in the bustling city of New York. Catherine nervously adjusted the black dress Eleanor had insisted she wear, a vintage Vera Wang that had belonged to the matriarch in her youth. You look stunning, Alexander murmured in her ear, as the maitre d' led them to their private table overlooking Central Park. Catherine noticed the curious looks of the other customers, probably recognizing the billionaire Montgomery, but for the first time she didn't feel diminished by them. So, this is your world, she commented softly, taking in the refined surroundings around her. No, Alexander replied, his eyes fixed on her. My world has completely changed since you entered it. The sommelier approached with a bottle of Krug champagne, and Catherine realized that the evening had been meticulously planned. As the golden bubbles danced in her glasses, she couldn't help but think about how drastically her life had changed in the last few months. Madison called today, she said, after they placed their orders. She wants to come visit me next holiday. Alexander raised an eyebrow. And how do you intend to explain us? The question hovered between them, loaded with implications. Catherine had avoided thinking much beyond the present, fearing the complications the future would certainly bring. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding," he continued, reaching for her hand across the table. "I don't want you to be a secret in my life, Catherine." At that moment, a camera flash illuminated their intimate moment. Catherine flinched instinctively, but Alexander kept their fingers intertwined. "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The tabloids, the speculation, all the drama?" "I want you," he replied simply. "The rest is just background noise." Dinner went like a dream, elaborate dishes served with artistic precision, deep conversations interspersed with moments of comfortable silence. But it was during dessert that Alexander completely surprised Catherine. "I bought an apartment," he announced casually. "In Greenwich Village." Catherine paused with the spoon of her chocolate soufflé in the air. "Why, because I want a place. That's just ours," he explained, his eyes revealing a rare vulnerability. "Without the weight of the Montgomery mansion, without the shadows of the past. A new beginning." Catherine's heart quickened. "Alexander." "I'm not asking for an answer right now," he hastened to say. "I just want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us." After dinner, they walked through Central Park, the city twinkling around them like 1,000 earthly stars. Catherine felt simultaneously ecstatic and terrified at the possibilities that opened up before her. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, stopping near the Bethesda fountain. "Before this goes any further." Alexander watched her carefully, waiting patiently as she gathered her courage. "When my parents died," she began, "it was because of a car accident. They were returning from a job interview. My father had lost everything in a botched investment. Madison had just been accepted into medical school, and they were desperate to find a way to pay." The tears began to fall, but Catherine continued. "I promised them on my deathbed that I would take care of Madison, that I would make sure she achieved her dream. That's why every penny I earn—" "Go to her," Alexander finished softly, pulling her into his arms. "And that's why you're so afraid to accept help." Catherine nodded against his chest, smelling the familiar scent that had become her safe haven. "I'm afraid I'll fail them in some way." "Your parents would be proud of you," he murmured into her hair, "of the strong and dedicated woman you have become. But they would also like you to be happy." A couple of tourists passed by, taking photos of the illuminated fountain. Catherine knew they were exposed there, that anyone could recognize Alexander Montgomery hugging an unknown woman in the middle of Central Park. But for once, she didn't care. "The apartment has a library," Alexander commented casually as they walked back to the car. "And an amazing view of the Hudson." Catherine couldn't help but smile. "Have you already furnished it?" "No," he replied, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. "I thought we could do this together." The drive back to Greenwich was filled with comfortable silence, their hands clasped together on the car's center console. Catherine watched the city lights pass by like shooting stars, each one carrying a desire, a possibility. At the mansion, Eleanor was waiting for them in the main hall, even though it was late at night. His discerning eyes immediately noticed the subtle change in the dynamic between them. So she smiled. Did Manhattan survive the Montgomerys' romance? "For now," Alexander replied, kissing his mother's forehead. "But the tabloids might have something to talk about tomorrow." Eleanor clapped her hands in delight. "Great. I was tired of all this secrecy. Richard and I took less time to come to terms with our relationship." "Mother," Alexander warned gently, but Catherine could see the smile in his eyes. That night in her room, Catherine found a small envelope on her bed. Inside was a key and a card with a Greenwich Village address, along with a simple message, "For when you're ready." Hai Soon, sitting on her bed, turning the key between her fingers, Catherine thought about her parents, about Madison, about all the promises and dreams she had carried alone for so long. Maybe it was time to allow someone else to help carry this weight. Maybe it was time to create new dreams. The New York Post's headline the next morning surprised no one. "Billionaire Alexander Montgomery caught with mysterious brunette in Central Park." The photo, although a little blurry, clearly showed the intimate moment they had shared near the Bethesda fountain. Catherine watched the first page with a mixture of apprehension and relief. as she ate breakfast in their small Greenwich Village apartment, her first sunrise in the new space Alexander had bought for them. The decision to spend the night there, although impulsive, seemed to mark a point of no return in their relationship. "The phones don't stop ringing in the mansion," Alexander commented, walking into the kitchen wearing nothing but pajama bottoms. "Rose is screening the calls, but apparently Victoria gave an exclusive interview to Page 6. "What did she say?" Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "That I have a history of getting involved with female employees," he replied, pouring himself some coffee, "and that explains why I called off the engagement so abruptly." The silence that followed was heavy. Catherine thought about Madison, about how her sister would react to finding out the truth from the tabloids. As if reading his thoughts, his cell phone vibrated with a message. "Sis, you're on the front page of NYP. Why didn't you tell me about you and Mr. Montgomery? I need all the details." "Well," Catherine sighed, showing the message to Alexander. "At least she doesn't seem upset." Alexander walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind the chair. "Madison is smart like her sister. She will understand that this is real, not a fabricated media scandal. And Eleanor, how is she dealing with all of this?" An amused smile appeared on Alexander's lips. "Apparently she's already given 3 interviews this morning, all defending our relationship and recalling her own love story with my father." Catherine couldn't help but laugh. Eleanor Montgomery had become an unexpected force in his life, and ally who fully understood the challenges of loving someone beyond social convention. The sound of the intercom interrupted the moment. It was the doorman announcing the arrival of several reporters at the building. Alexander swore under his breath. "We need to get back to Greenwich," he said, already pulling out his phone. "I'll ask Frank to bring the car around the back." During the drive back, Catherine watched the city awaken through the tinted windows of the Audi. Her life had changed drastically in a matter of hours, and yet something inside her felt lighter, more complete. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, noticing your contemplative silence. "How unpredictable life is," she answered honestly. "A year ago, I was in Idaho, desperate for a job that could help Madison. Now you're causing a social scandal with one of Manhattan's most eligible bachelors," he added with a wry smile. "My PR department is going to throw a fit. Do you regret it?" The question came out before she could stop it. Alexander braked the car gently, turning to face her intensely. "Catherine Thompson, you are the best decision I have ever made in my entire life, and I intend to spend every day proving that to you." At the Montgomery mansion, they were greeted by a beaming Eleanor and a visibly relieved Rose to see them. "Photographers are camped at the main gate," Rose reported, as she served tea in the Winter Hall. "But Mrs. Montgomery has already given orders to tighten security. And I also made some clarifying statements," Eleanor added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, "including how Catherine saved this family from emotional ruin, and how she reminds me so much of myself in my youth." "Mother," Alexander protested, but there was no real irritation in his voice. "Oh, darling, let me enjoy my moment. It's not every day I get to relive my own love story through you two." Catherine felt her heart clench with emotion. Eleanor's unconditional acceptance, so different from what she expected from a high-society matriarch, was a precious gift. "Madison wants to come visit next weekend," she announced softly. "If it's okay." "Of course you are," Eleanor exclaimed before Alexander could respond. "I've already asked them to prepare the guest room. I can't wait to meet your sister, dear." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of calls, emails, and decisions about how to deal with the media. Montgomery Enterprises' public relations department worked tirelessly to control the narrative, but in the end it was a simple photo posted by Eleanor on her social media that changed everything. The image showed Catherine and Alexander in the gazebo laughing at something Eleanor had said. It was a genuine, unposed moment that perfectly captured the joy and love between them. The caption simply read, "True love finds its way no matter the circumstances. Welcome to the family, Catherine." That night, lying in Alexander's arms in her new Greenwich Village apartment, Catherine finally allowed herself to believe that some modern fairy tales could in fact come true. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured sleepily, tracing soft patterns on your back. How life sometimes surprises us in the best way possible, she replied, snuggling closer to him. And how glad I am that I was brave enough to accept this surprise. News of Catherine and Alexander's relationship dominated headlines for days, creating shockwaves that spread far beyond Greenwich's social circles. Montgomery Company's board of directors called an emergency meeting, concerned about the impact the scandal could have on the company's shares. "They want me to make an official statement," Alexander informed Catherine as they ate breakfast in their Greenwich Village apartment. "Apparently, some conservative investors are nervous about my impulsiveness." Catherine bit her lip, worried. "And what are you going to say? The truth," he replied, simply reaching for her hand across the table. "That I found someone who makes me want to be a better person, and that person's origins are irrelevant." The sound of the intercom interrupted the moment. It was Madison who had arrived earlier than expected for her visit. Catherine felt her heart quicken. This would be the first real meeting between her sister and Alexander. Madison entered the apartment like a hurricane of energy and enthusiasm. "Sis, I can't believe you hid this from me for so long." She hugged Catherine tightly before turning to Alexander. "And you, I hope you know how lucky you are." Alexander smiled genuinely, enchanted by Madison's spontaneity. "Believe me, I know very well." The next few hours were filled with shared stories, laughter, and inevitably a few tears when Madison mentioned her parents. "They would be so proud of you, Kath," Madison said softly. "Not just for me, but for finding your own happiness as well." Catherine felt her eyes fill with tears. "Sometimes I wonder if they would approve." "They would approve," Madison interrupted firmly. "They always said that a person's true worth is in their character, not their bank account. And from what I've seen so far," she gave Alexander a meaningful look, "you found someone who understands that." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the apartment, Victoria Bennett, accompanied by her lawyer. Catherine felt her stomach sink as she saw Alexander's ex-fiancée standing in the doorway. "We need to talk," Victoria announced, her stiff posture betraying her tension. "In private." Alexander stood protectively at Catherine's side. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of her." Victoria hesitated, her blue eyes switching between the couple. "The company's shares have fallen 3% since the news broke. The board is concerned about the stability of the leadership. And you came to offer a solution," Alexander asked, his tone icy. "I came to offer a dignified exit," Victoria replied. "A joint statement saying that our breakup was amicable and that you are focused on the company. No scandalous romances." With the staff, Madison, who had remained silently observing, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I think you're confusing things. My sister is not servant. She is an incredible woman who sacrificed everything to give me an education after we lost our parents." Victoria seemed momentarily disconcerted by the intervention. Catherine felt a surge of pride and love for her little sister. "The council needs to understand one thing," Alexander said calmly. "My personal life is not up for negotiation. Catherine makes me a better leader, a better man. If they can't see that, maybe it's time to reevaluate the makeup of the board." After Victoria's stormy departure, the apartment fell silent. Madison was the first to break it. "Well, that was dramatic," she commented, making everyone laugh and relieving the tension. Later that night, after Madison retired to the guest room, Catherine found Alexander on the porch gazing at the city lights. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, wrapping her arms around his waist. "How your sister is exactly as you described, strong, loyal, and unafraid to stand up for what she believes in," he replied, turning to face her. "And how lucky I am to have you both in my life." Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. "Honey, I just saw Victoria's interview on the news. Don't worry, I've got it covered. No one messes with the Montgomery family." Catherine showed the message to Alexander, who laughed. "My mother has always been a force of nature. But since you came into our lives, she seems to have found a new purpose." "In defending our love?" Catherine asked with a smile. "In ensuring that her and my father's story resonates with the next generation," he replied, kissing her softly. The lights of Manhattan twinkled around them, like earthly stars, silent witnesses to a love that continued to grow and strengthen despite the storms it faced. In the next room, Madison slept peacefully, her dreams protected by the love of a sister who never hesitated to put her first. And in Greenwich, Eleanor Montgomery smiled contentedly, knowing that her son had finally found his true north. The front page of the Wall Street Journal that morning brought a surprise that no one expected. Alexander Montgomery renews Board of Directors historic changes at Montgomery Companies. The article detailed how the CEO had orchestrated a significant reorganization, bringing more diversity and progressive vision to corporate leadership. "You didn't tell me about that," Catherine commented, watching Alexander adjust his tie as he prepared for a press conference. "I wanted to make sure it worked first," he replied, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror's reflection. "The old board was too stuck in the past. We needed people who understood that family values and business success are not mutually exclusive." The news had an immediate effect. The company's shares rose 5% in the first hours of trading. Victoria Bennett gave a hurried interview praising her ex-fiancé's groundbreaking vision, a notable change from her previous tone. Madison, who had extended her stay in New York to follow the events, was fascinated by the whole situation. "It's like watching an episode of Succession live," she joked over breakfast. Eleanor, in turn, couldn't be more proud. "Richard always said that one day Alexander would understand that leadership isn't just about numbers," she commented during a tour of his Greenwich Village apartment. He needed to find something or someone that would make him see beyond the spreadsheets. The transformation was not just limited to business. Catherine noticed subtle changes in Alexander, the way he now made a point of having dinner with his family, how he started taking time to get to know each of the mansion's employees personally, how his smiles became more frequent and genuine. "You know what impresses me most," Madison commented one night while helping Catherine prepare dinner. "How the two of you complement each other. He gives you the confidence to dream beyond your responsibilities, and you teach him to see value in simple things." The remark touched Catherine deeply. For so long she had defined herself only by her obligations, first to her parents, then to Madison. Now, for the first time, he was learning to balance caring for others and his own happiness. One afternoon, Alexander surprised her with an unexpected visit to UCLA, where Madison was studying. The campus tour brought tears to Catherine's eyes as she saw the laboratory where her sister conducted her research, a dream come true thanks to shared sacrifices. "Our parents would be so proud," Madison whispered, hugging her sister as they watched the Californian sunset. "Not just for the achievements, but for us finally seeing you happy, Kath." Back in New York, they found Eleanor hosting a benefit at the Montgomery mansion, the first since Catherine and Alexander's relationship became public. The guest list included prominent names in society, but also people that Eleanor was keen to recognize: professors, researchers, social workers. "The true elite," she declared, "are those who make a difference in the lives of others." On the night of the event, Catherine surprised everyone with an impromptu speech about the importance of breaking down social barriers and valuing genuine connections. His sincerity and eloquence won over even the most skeptical guests. "You keep surprising me," Alexander murmured in her ear during a dance. "Every day I discover something new to love about you." Soft music lulled the couples in the mansion's ballroom, but for Catherine and Alexander, it was as if they were alone in the world. Their gazes met, filled with unspoken promises and shared dreams. "Did you know this is where my parents danced?" "For the first time," Eleanor commented, approaching the couple. "Richard was so nervous he stepped on her dress 3 times. The story made everyone laugh, breaking the tension that always accompanied social events of this size. Catherine looked around the room full of people, some who had initially judged her, others who had supported her from the beginning, and realized that she no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone. Madison, stunning in a dress lent by Eleanor, moved around the room with ease, chatting with researchers and potential mentors. His bright future was a testimony to the power of brotherly love and perseverance. "I think I finally understand," Alexander said softly as they watched the scene. "Understand what my father always said about true wealth," he replied, shaking her hand. "It's not about what you have, it's about the lives you touch." The event stretched into the night, but Catherine and Alexander found a moment to escape to the gazebo, their special place since that first night that changed everything. The city lights twinkled in the distance like earthly stars bearing witness to their love. "You changed my life," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not for the resources or opportunities, but for making me believe that I deserve to be happy too." Alexander pulled her closer, his eyes reflecting all the love he felt. "And you taught me that life is so much richer when shared with someone who sees beyond appearances." The distant sound of music and conversation reached them, reminding them of the world beyond that moment. But here, under the stars of Greenwich, Catherine and Alexander knew they had found something rare and precious, a love that transcended class expectations and fears. Eleanor watched them discreetly from the mansion, a satisfied smile on her lips. As Richard used to say, sometimes fate has surprising ways of bringing together souls who were meant for each other. Morning light streamed through the windows of the Greenwich Village apartment, finding Catherine deep in thought as she organized the latest photographs in her wedding album. 6 months had passed since that night in the gazebo, and each day seemed to bring a new discovery, a new reason to smile. The sound of her cell phone brought her back to the present. It was Madison, overjoyed with the news that her research article would be published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals. "Sis, you won't believe it. The advisor said it's one of the best jobs he's ever seen." Catherine felt her heart expand with pride. The dream that had begun with a promise to his parents was finally materializing in all its fullness. Madison was no longer just a medical student. She was becoming a respected researcher, ready to make her own mark on the world. "We need to celebrate," Alexander declared, entering the room, still adjusting his tie. "How about a family dinner next?" Weekend, Eleanor can't wait to show off the changes she's made to the mansion's conservatory. The Montgomery mansion had undergone its own transformations in recent months. Under Eleanor's guidance, the once formal and intimidating spaces had become more welcoming, reflecting the new family dynamic that had been established. "Speaking of Eleanor," Catherine smiled. She called earlier. Apparently the Montgomery Foundation board unanimously approved the new scholarship program for young scientists. Alexander paused, his eyes meeting hers with pride and love. The idea for the program had come about during a casual conversation about helping other students like Madison, bright young people who just needed an opportunity to shine. "You have transformed not just my life," he said softly, moving closer to kiss her, "but the entire way the Montgomery family interacts with the world." The intercom interrupted the moment it was Victoria Bennett, a visit that would have caused anxiety months ago but now provoked only mild curiosity. Since the board's restructuring, Victoria had surprisingly become an ally, recognizing that change did not always mean loss. "Catherine," Victoria greeted with a genuine smile, "I personally came to deliver this." She held out an elegant envelope. "It's an invitation to the launch of my new foundation to support women entrepreneurs. You've inspired me more than you know." The confession took Catherine by surprise. Yes," Victoria nodded. "Seeing how you maintained your integrity and dignity even under intense public scrutiny made me question many of my own choices and values." After Victoria's departure, Catherine found Alexander in his home office, reviewing company documents. Montgomery Companies had recorded its best quarter in years, not just in numbers but in positive social impact. "Sometimes I wonder," she commented, sitting on the edge of her desk, "if our parents somehow knew all this would happen, if they could see beyond that terrible night of the accident." Alexander held her hand, intertwining their fingers. "They raised a daughter strong enough to follow her heart without ever losing her values. I think that says a lot about their legacy." The phone rang. It was Rose informing her that Eleanor had organized a surprise lunch at the mansion to welcome Madison, who would be arriving early for her visit. "Mrs. Montgomery is unstoppable," Rose laughed. "Already changed the decor in the dining room 3 times today." On the way to Greenwich, Catherine observed the familiar landscape with new eyes. Every bend in the road told a part of her story, from the determined young housekeeper to the woman who found her own voice without ever forgetting her roots. The Montgomery mansion welcomed them with the scent of fresh roses, Eleanor's favorite, and the sound of laughter coming from the conservatory. Madison had already arrived and was engaged in a lively discussion with Eleanor about the latest advances in medical research. "Ah, finally," Eleanor exclaimed when she saw them. "Madison was telling me about your article. Catherine, honey, you should see the sparkle in her eyes when she talks about her work. Just like you do when you talk about your projects with the foundation." Lunch was filled with stories and plans for the future. Madison shared her intention to establish a free clinic after her residency. Eleanor spoke about expanding the Montgomery Foundation's social programs. Alexander and Catherine exchanged knowing glances, knowing they had created something much bigger than themselves. "You know what impresses me most?" Madison commented as they enjoyed dessert. "How everything fell into place perfectly. How that terrible night, which seemed like the end of everything, was actually just the beginning of something extraordinary." Catherine felt tears form in her eyes. "Mom always said that God writes straight on crooked lines." "And how right she was," Eleanor added softly. "Just like Richard was, when he said that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in lives touched and hearts changed." In the late afternoon, as the sun painted the Greenwich sky in shades of pink and gold, Catherine and Alexander found a moment of stillness in the gazebo, their special place where it all truly began. "Do you know what I noticed?" he murmured, hugging her from behind as they watched the sunset. "That sometimes we need to lose something to find what really matters." Catherine smiled, leaning back against him. "Like a billionaire who had to have his heart broken to learn how to truly love, or a housekeeper who had to take care of everyone around her before allowing anyone else to take care of her," he added, kissing her neck softly. The sound of laughter coming from the mansion, Madison and Eleanor planning some new adventure together, was the perfect soundtrack to that moment. The family they had built, not through blood ties, but through choices of the heart, was a living testimony that true love knows no barriers. "Forever?" Catherine asked softly, turning to face him. "Forever," Alexander replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. The Montgomery mansion would forever hold the story of how two souls found each other in unlikely circumstances, proving that second chances and open hearts can create the most beautiful chapters of our lives. Took Catherine by surprise. Yes, Victoria nodded. "Seeing how you maintained your integrity and dignity, even under intense public scrutiny, made me question many of my own choices and values." After Victoria's departure, Catherine found Alexander in his home office, reviewing company documents. Montgomery Companies had recorded its best quarter in years, not just in numbers but in positive social impact. "Sometimes I wonder," she commented, sitting on the edge of her desk, "if our parents somehow knew all this would happen, if they could see beyond that terrible night of the accident." Alexander held her hand, intertwining their fingers. "They raised a daughter strong enough to follow her heart without ever losing her values. I think that says a lot about their legacy." The phone rang. It was Rose informing her that Eleanor had organized a surprise lunch at the mansion to welcome Madison, who would be arriving early for her visit. "Mrs. Montgomery is unstoppable," Rose laughed. "Already changed the decor in the dining room 3 times today." On the way to Greenwich, Catherine observed the familiar landscape with new eyes. Every bend in the road told a part of her story, from the determined young housekeeper to the woman who found her own voice without ever forgetting her roots. The Montgomery mansion welcomed them with the scent of fresh roses, Eleanor's favorite, and the sound of laughter coming from the conservatory. Madison had already arrived and was engaged in a lively discussion with Eleanor about the latest advances in medical research. "Ah, finally," Eleanor exclaimed when she saw them. "Madison was telling me about your article. Catherine, honey, you should see the sparkle in her eyes when she talks about her work, just like you do when you talk about your projects with the foundation." Lunch was filled with stories and plans for the future. Madison shared her intention to establish a free clinic after her residency. Eleanor spoke about expanding the Montgomery Foundation's social programs. Alexander and Catherine exchanged knowing glances, knowing they had created something much bigger than themselves. "I know what impresses me most," Madison commented as they enjoyed dessert. "How everything fell into place perfectly. How that terrible night, which seemed like the end of everything, was actually just the beginning of something extraordinary." Catherine felt tears form in her eyes. "Mom always said that God writes straight on crooked lines." And how right she was, Eleanor added softly. Just like Richard was when he said that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in lives touched and hearts changed. In the late afternoon, as the sun painted the Greenwich sky in shades of pink and gold, Catherine and Alexander found a moment of stillness in the gazebo, their special place where it all truly began. "Do you know what I noticed?" he murmured, hugging her from behind as they watched the sunset. "That sometimes we need to lose something to find what really matters." Catherine smiled, leaning back against him. Like a billionaire who had to have his heart broken to learn how to truly love, or a housekeeper who had to take care of everyone around her before allowing anyone else to take care of her, he added, kissing her neck softly. The sound of laughter coming from the mansion, Madison and Eleanor planning some new adventure together, was the perfect soundtrack to that moment. The family they had built, not through blood ties, but through choices of the heart, was a living testimony that true love knows no barriers. "Forever?" Catherine asked softly, turning to face him. "Forever," Alexander replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. The Montgomery mansion would forever hold the story of how two souls found each other in unlikely circumstances, proving that second chances and open hearts can create the most beautiful chapters of our lives.